The champagne flute slipped from my fingers as my son David's words cut through the elegant dinner party like a blade. "Mom's between jobs right now," he said with that casual, dismissive tone I'd grown to hate. His new wife, Jessica, added the killing blow with a perfect society smile. "Probably forever." The laughter that followed wasn't kind. It was the sound wealthy people make when they think poverty is amusing. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below and hit that like and subscribe button. I'm Margaret Walsh, and at 54 I thought I'd heard every possible way to be humiliated by family. I was wrong. Sitting at that mahogany table in the Reynolds mansion, surrounded by crystal and silk, I realized my son had married into exactly the kind of family that measures human worth in dollar signs. The irony was delicious, really, because none of them knew what had happened just 6 hours earlier. David had met Jessica Reynolds 8 months ago at some charity gala where young lawyers network with old money. She was 28, blonde, and had that particular kind of beauty that comes from excellent genetics and expensive maintenance. More importantly, she was the daughter of Robert Reynolds, who owned Reynolds Holdings, a mid-sized investment firm that specialized in buying struggling companies and turning them profitable. "Margaret works in, what is it again, Mom?" "Customer service." Jessica's mother, Patricia, asked, her tone suggesting customer service ranked somewhere below street sweeping in her personal hierarchy of respectability. "I was a manager at Hartwell Communications," I corrected gently, though the past tense stung. 22 years with the company was, Robert Reynolds emphasized with obvious satisfaction. "Hartwell went under last month, didn't it? Shame about all those people losing their jobs." The conversation moved on to safer topics for the wealthy: their recent trip to the Hamptons, the new yacht they were considering, Jessica's plans to redecorate their guest house. I smiled and nodded and played the role of the grateful mother-in-law, all while remembering the phone call I'd received that morning. "Mrs. Walsh, this is James Morrison from Morrison Stewart and Associates. I'm calling about your Aunt Helena's estate. I'm afraid there's been a significant development we need to discuss immediately." Aunt Helena, my father's eccentric sister, who'd moved to Switzerland 40 years ago and barely stayed in touch. The family had always assumed she was living some bohemian artist lifestyle, scraping by on whatever money she could make selling her paintings to tourists. "I'm sorry to inform you that Miss Helena Walsh passed away 3 weeks ago in Geneva. However, I'm pleased to tell you that you've been named the sole beneficiary of her estate. I'd expected maybe a few thousand and some sentimental items." Instead, James Morrison had delivered news that changed everything. The estate is valued at approximately $47 million. "Mrs. Walsh, your aunt was quite successful in her investments." $47 million. I'd spent the rest of the morning in Morrison's office signing papers and trying to process the magnitude of what had happened. By noon, I had access to more money than I'd ever dreamed of. By 6 p.m., I was sitting at this dinner party listening to my son's wife mock my employment status while her father bragged about acquiring failing businesses for pennies on the dollar. "The key," Robert was explaining to David over the dessert course, "is to identify companies that are struggling but still have valuable assets. You buy them cheap, strip out the unnecessary expenses, usually starting with the older employees, and restructure for maximum profit." "Sounds brilliant," David said with genuine admiration. "You must have quite a portfolio by now." 43 companies in the last 5 years, Robert replied proudly. "Including some recent acquisitions that are going to be extremely profitable once we finish the restructuring process." That's when I realized I was watching a masterclass in corporate cruelty delivered by people who saw human suffering as a line item to be eliminated. But I was also seeing an opportunity. "And what kind of companies do you typically target?" I asked innocently. Robert warmed to his favorite subject. "Communications firms usually. Technology companies that haven't kept up with the market. Small manufacturing operations that family businesses can't afford to modernize. The owners are usually desperate to sell before they lose everything." "How fascinating," I murmured, filing away every word. The evening ended with polite kisses and promises to do this again soon. David and Jessica drove me home to my modest apartment, chattering about wedding plans and honeymoon destinations. They were thinking Tuscany, Jessica explained, though it would be expensive. Maybe Mom can help with the costs, David suggested as they dropped me off. I mean, once you find another job. I watched their BMW disappear down the street, then climbed the stairs to my apartment and pulled out the business card James Morrison had given me that morning. On the back, he'd written the private number for his colleague who specialized in corporate acquisitions. It was 11 p.m., but some conversations can't wait until morning. Sarah Chen speaking. Miss Chen, this is Margaret Walsh. James Morrison gave me your number. I need to make an acquisition and I need it done quickly and quietly. What kind of acquisition, Mrs. Walsh? I looked at the framed photo on my mantel. David at his law school graduation, his arm around me. Both of us smiling with pride and hope for his future. That young man had been replaced by someone I didn't recognize, someone who found his mother's misfortune amusing. I want to buy Reynolds Holdings, I said. All of it. There was a pause. Then, Mrs. Walsh, that's a $40 million company. I know, I replied. Is that a problem? The next morning, I woke up wondering if the previous day had been an elaborate dream. Then I checked my bank balance and saw 8 figures staring back at me, and reality hit like a freight train carrying $47 million worth of possibilities. Sarah Chen had been appropriately professional during our late-night call, but I could hear the curiosity in her voice as she explained the complexities of a hostile takeover. Reynolds Holdings was privately held, which actually made things easier. No SEC filings to navigate, no public stockholders to worry about, just one very smug man who had no idea his world was about to change. The key is finding leverage, Sarah had explained. Something that makes them want to sell or something that gives us the upper hand in negotiations. I spent Sunday morning doing research that would have made David proud if he knew his supposedly unemployable mother was about to execute a corporate acquisition that would make his law school professors weep with admiration. Robert Reynolds had built his empire by being ruthless, but he'd also been careless about covering his tracks. Reynolds Holdings specialized in acquiring distressed companies, but their business model had a darker side. They targeted family businesses in financial trouble, offered what seemed like lifelines, then systematically destroyed them for parts. The family that had run Thompson Manufacturing for 60 years lost everything when Reynolds stripped their assets and sold the real estate to developers. Hartwell Communications, my former employer, had been gutted so thoroughly that 200 people lost their jobs just before Christmas. But Robert Reynolds had made one crucial mistake. He'd been telling the truth at dinner when he bragged about his recent acquisitions. 3 of his last 5 purchases were companies I could prove had been systematically undervalued through questionable accounting practices. More importantly, 2 of those deals involved pension funds that had mysteriously disappeared during the acquisitions. By Monday morning, I had enough information to bury Robert Reynolds in litigation for the next decade. But I had something much more elegant in mind. I met Sarah Chen at her downtown office, a sleek space with glass walls that screamed expensive competence. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe 40, with sharp black hair and the kind of focused intensity that suggested she ate lesser lawyers for breakfast. Mrs. Walsh, I have to ask, what's your relationship to Reynolds Holdings? I told her about David and Jessica, about the dinner party, about Robert's casual cruelty toward people like me. Sarah's expression shifted from professional interest to something that looked almost predatory. So this is personal. Very, I confirmed. But I want it done legally and completely. No shortcuts, no questionable tactics. When this is over, I want Robert Reynolds to know exactly who destroyed his empire and why. Sarah smiled for the first time since I'd met her. Mrs. Walsh, I think you and I are going to work very well together. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Reynolds Holdings was profitable but cash poor, having overextended themselves on their recent acquisitions. They'd been financing their expansion through a complex web of loans and credit arrangements that looked impressive on paper, but were actually quite fragile. We don't need to buy the whole company, Sarah explained. We just need to control enough of their debt to force a sale. Within 48 hours, Sarah had mapped out Reynolds Holdings' entire financial structure. They owed money to 17 different entities, and their largest creditor, a pension fund investment group, was getting nervous about some irregularities they discovered in the Reynolds portfolio. How nervous? I asked. Nervous enough to sell their debt position to us for 60 cents on the dollar, especially if we can provide evidence that Reynolds might not be able to pay. And if we own their debt, then we become their largest creditor. And if they can't pay, which they won't be able to once we call in certain loans, we can force them into bankruptcy or a distressed sale. It was beautiful. Really, Robert Reynolds had built his fortune by financial manipulation. And now those same tactics would be his downfall. But the sweetest part was that I wouldn't just be destroying his company, I'd be acquiring it. How long? I asked. 2 weeks if everything goes according to plan, maybe less if they panic. I thought about Jessica's wedding dress, still hanging in her childhood bedroom, waiting for a June ceremony that would now have very different implications. I thought about David, already mentally spending money his in-laws wouldn't have much longer. Make it happen, I said. Sarah started making calls before I'd even left her office. By Thursday we owned 38% of Reynolds Holdings' debt. By Friday we'd acquired controlling interest in 2 of their subsidiary companies. And on Saturday morning, exactly 1 week after Robert Reynolds had humiliated me at his dinner table, I got the call I'd been waiting for. Mrs. Walsh, this is Robert Reynolds. I think we need to talk. I was in my kitchen making coffee in my modest apartment when the man who'd mocked my unemployed status called to beg for mercy. The irony was so perfect I almost laughed. Of course, Robert, what can I do for you? I think you know what this is about. Your people have been very aggressive in the market this week. My people don't play games with me, Margaret. I know what you're doing. The question is what you want. I stirred honey into my coffee and looked out the window at the ordinary suburban street where I'd lived for the past 5 years. Next week I could buy any house in this city. But right now I was exactly where I wanted to be. What I want, Robert, is to meet with you tomorrow morning. Your office? 9 a.m. Come alone. Margaret, whatever you think you're accomplishing. 9 a.m. I repeated and hung up. I spent the rest of Saturday planning exactly what I was going to say to the man who treated me like garbage while stealing the livelihood of hundreds of people like me. But first I had a phone call to make. David's mom. I hope I'm not interrupting your Saturday. Mom, hi. No, we were just having brunch with Jessica's parents. Actually, her dad's been acting weird all week. Some business thing has him stressed out. I'm sure it's nothing serious, I said, fighting to keep the satisfaction out of my voice. Listen, sweetheart. I wanted to talk to you about something. Could you and Jessica come to dinner tomorrow night? There's something I need to tell you both. Her mom. Is everything okay? You sound different. Everything's fine, honey. Better than fine. Actually, I'll see you tomorrow at 7 o'clock. After I hung up, I sat in my living room surrounded by furniture I'd bought at discount stores and thought about the conversation I'd be having with my son in 24 hours. David was about to learn some very important lessons about respect, consequences, and the danger of underestimating his supposedly worthless mother. But first, I had to finish destroying his father-in-law's empire. Sunday morning arrived crisp and clear, the kind of October day that makes you believe in second chances. I dressed carefully for my meeting with Robert Reynolds, a simple black suit I'd bought for job interviews, paired with my grandmother's pearl earrings. Nothing flashy, nothing that would telegraph the $47 million sitting in my bank account. Reynolds Holdings occupied 3 floors of a gleaming downtown tower, the kind of building that announces its occupants' importance through marble lobbies and brass fixtures. I'd never been inside before, though I'd driven past it countless times during my years at Hartwell Communications. The receptionist looked confused when I gave my name. Mr. Reynolds is expecting me, I said with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from knowing you hold all the cards. Robert's office was exactly what I'd expected. Mahogany and leather with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. He was standing with his back to the door when I entered, staring out at the skyline like a man contemplating his own mortality. 40 years, he said without turning around. I built this company from nothing. 3 employees and a borrowed desk in 1984. Impressive, I replied, settling into the chair across from his desk without being invited. Though I notice you left out the part about the 200 families you've destroyed along the way. He turned to face me then, and I saw something I'd never seen in Robert Reynolds before. Fear, real, bone-deep terror of losing everything he'd spent a lifetime accumulating. What do you want, Margaret? Accountability, I said simply. And justice for people like me. He moved to his desk, shuffling through papers with hands that shook slightly. I can offer you a settlement. Enough to make this go away quietly. How much? 5 million cash. Untraceable. I pretended to consider it, watching hope flicker in his eyes. That's generous, Robert, but I'm afraid I'm not interested in bribes. Then what? I leaned forward, meeting his gaze directly. I want you to sell me your company. The silence stretched between us like a taut wire. Outside the city hummed with Sunday morning traffic. People going about their normal lives while Robert Reynolds' world crumbled in real time. That's impossible, he said finally. This company is worth $40 million. Actually, as of Friday's close, it's worth about $12 million thanks to some unfortunate revelations about your pension fund irregularities. But I'm prepared to be generous. 15 million cash, complete acquisition. The company isn't for sale. I smiled, the same polite expression I'd worn during Thursday's dinner party. Oh, Robert, I think you misunderstand. This isn't a negotiation. I opened my purse and withdrew a folder Sarah Chin had prepared, thick with legal documents and financial statements. You currently owe $34 million to various creditors. As of Friday afternoon, I own 87% of that debt, which means I can call in those loans whenever I choose. His face went ashen. You can't do that. Actually, I can. Your credit agreements have some very interesting clauses about material changes in business circumstances. The federal investigation into your pension fund management definitely qualifies. What federal investigation? I pulled out another document. This one bearing official government letterhead. The one that begins tomorrow morning when the Department of Labor receives a comprehensive dossier detailing your questionable accounting practices. Though I suppose if you were to sell the company before that investigation becomes public, he sank into his chair like a deflating balloon. For 40 years, Robert Reynolds had been the predator, circling wounded companies like a shark scenting blood. Now he knew how his victims had felt. You're destroying me. I'm holding you accountable. There's a difference. The contract negotiations took 3 hours. Sarah Chin handled the legal details while I sat in the conference room, watching Robert Reynolds sign away his life's work with the same dead-eyed resignation I'd seen in the faces of every business owner he'd ever crushed. By 2 p.m. I owned Reynolds Holdings in its entirety. All 43 companies, all the assets, all the debts, and all the power that came with them. I also owned something else. The satisfaction of watching Robert Reynolds walk out of his own building carrying nothing but a briefcase and the knowledge that his son-in-law's mother had just become his boss. Well, his former boss, because my first executive decision was to fire him. I spent the rest of the afternoon in the office that was now mine, going through files and understanding the full scope of what I'd acquired. The companies Reynolds had gutted could be restored. The pension funds could be repaid. The families he destroyed could receive compensation. But first I had a dinner party to attend. David and Jessica arrived at my apartment at exactly 7 o'clock. Jessica carrying a bottle of wine that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. She dressed down for the occasion. Designer jeans and a cashmere sweater that suggested she was trying to connect with the common folk. "Mom, you look great," David said, kissing my cheek. Rested. "I feel wonderful, actually. Sit down, both of you. Can I get you anything to drink?" "Wine would be lovely," Jessica replied, glancing around my modest living room with the kind of forced smile people use when visiting elderly relatives in nursing homes. I poured 3 glasses of the wine Jessica had brought, noting the label, a $200 bottle from Robert's personal collection. How thoughtful of him to contribute to his own wake. "So," David said, settling onto my couch with Jessica tucked against his side. "You said you had something to tell us." "I do." I sat in the chair across from them, holding my wine glass like a shield. "I wanted to share some news about my employment situation." Jessica perked up with obvious relief. "Oh, that's wonderful. Did you find another customer service position?" "Actually, I've moved into corporate acquisitions." "Acquisitions?" David looked confused. "Mom, that's a pretty specialized field. Don't you need extensive financial experience?" "You think so?" I agreed. But apparently I had more transferable skills than anyone expected. "What kind of acquisitions?" Jessica asked, though she was clearly humoring what she assumed was her mother-in-law's midlife fantasy. "Well, just this morning I acquired an investment firm downtown. 43 companies actually, though they'll be managed as subsidiaries." David laughed, the indulgent sound parents make when children claim they're going to be astronauts. Oh, that's great. Are you talking about some kind of entry-level position? Maybe administrative support? No, sweetheart. I own the company. All of it. The silence that followed was profound. Jessica's wine glass stopped halfway to her lips. David's smile froze in place like a photograph of happiness. I'm sorry, Jessica said carefully. I think I misunderstood. You said you own a company. Reynolds Holdings, I clarified. I bought it this morning. Cash transaction. Jessica's wine glass slipped from her fingers, creating a red stain on my beige carpet that looked remarkably like blood. She was staring at me as if I'd suddenly sprouted additional heads. That's impossible, David said. Mom, Reynolds Holdings is worth millions of dollars. 40 million to be precise, though I got it for considerably less. David's voice took on the patient tone people use with confused elderly relatives. I think you might be confused about something. Maybe someone offered you a job there. Or I reached into my purse and withdrew the contract Sarah Chen had prepared, the one bearing my signature and Robert Reynolds' defeated scrawl. Would you like to see the paperwork? David took the contract with shaking hands, Jessica reading over his shoulder. I watched their faces change as they processed what they were seeing. The dollar amounts, the legal language, the undeniable reality that David's unemployable mother had just bought his father-in-law's empire. Where did you get this kind of money? Jessica whispered. Inheritance, I replied cheerfully. Turns out Aunt Helena was quite successful in Switzerland. $47 million successful to be exact. The room went so quiet I could hear the clock ticking in my kitchen. David was still staring at the contract as if it might rearrange itself into something that made sense. So you're saying, Jessica said slowly, that you've been secretly wealthy this entire time? Not the entire time. Just since Thursday morning. Thursday, Jessica repeated, the day before our dinner party. Yes. Interesting timing, wasn't it? That's when I saw understanding dawn in Jessica's eyes, followed immediately by horror. She was remembering Thursday night, remembering her mother's condescending questions, remembering her own casual cruelty about my employment prospects. Oh God, she whispered. Your father's going to kill me. But David was still processing the financial implications. Mom, this means you're, he trailed off, unable to complete the thought. Wealthy beyond my wildest dreams? I suggested. Yes, sweetheart. Though I have to say, my dreams have gotten quite a bit wilder lately. I took a sip of Robert's expensive wine and smiled at the two people who'd found my poverty so amusing just 4 days earlier. Now then, I continued, let's talk about your wedding plans. The conversation that followed was like watching two people discover they'd been swimming with sharks while wearing meat suits. David kept looking between the contract and my face as if one of them might suddenly make sense, while Jessica had gone pale enough to audition for vampire movies. I don't understand, David said finally. If you inherited this money on Thursday, why didn't you tell us? When would I have mentioned it? I asked innocently. During your charming dinner conversation about my unemployable status? Or perhaps when your wife suggested my job prospects were hopeless? Jessica flinched as if I'd slapped her. Mrs. Walsh, I'm so sorry. If you'd known I was wealthy, you would have treated me with respect. I interrupted. How fascinating. So courtesy is a privilege that must be purchased. That's not what I meant. Jessica stammered. I just meant you meant that poor people deserve to be mocked, but rich people deserve politeness. Got it. David set down the contract and rubbed his face with both hands. Mom, this is insane. You bought Robert's entire company, his life's work. The same life's work built on destroying families like ours. Yes, I did. Though I prefer to think of it as a hostile takeover with extremely personal motivations. Personal motivations? Jessica's voice cracked on the words. What do you mean? I reached for the wine bottle, Robert's wine, which somehow made everything taste better, and refilled my glass. Oh, let's see. Your father spent Thursday evening explaining his business model, which apparently involves buying struggling companies and stripping them for parts. He seemed particularly proud of eliminating unnecessary expenses, which is corporate speak for firing anyone over 50. He's a businessman, Jessica said weakly. He has to make tough decisions, like the tough decision to steal pension funds from Hartwell Communications. That's my former employer. In case you forgot, 200 people lost their jobs so your father could increase his profit margins. Pension funds? David looked confused. What are you talking about? I pulled out another folder, this one containing the evidence Sarah Chin had compiled about Reynolds Holdings' questionable accounting practices. Would you like to see the documentation? It makes for fascinating reading if you enjoy stories about white-collar theft. Jessica was shaking now, actually trembling as the magnitude of the situation hit her. You can't prove anything. My father is completely legal in everything he does. Legal and ethical aren't the same thing, dear. Though I have to say some of these pension fund irregularities do venture into questionable legal territory. Are you threatening him? David asked, his voice taking on an edge I'd rarely heard. Threatening? No, sweetheart. I'm simply explaining why I felt compelled to remove your father-in-law from his position of power. People like Robert Reynolds destroy lives because they can. Now he can't. David stood up abruptly, pacing to the window and back. Mom, do you realize what you've done? You've destroyed Jessica's family. Robert's entire identity is wrapped up in that company. And my entire identity was wrapped up in being your mother until you decided I was an embarrassment. The words hung in the air between us like a guillotine blade. David stopped pacing, his face cycling through emotions, confusion, hurt, anger, and finally something that might have been shame. I never said you were an embarrassment. You didn't have to. Your actions said it quite clearly. Jessica was crying now. Quiet tears that didn't stop her from trying to salvage the situation. Mrs. Walsh, please. I know we didn't handle Thursday night well, but surely we can work something out. Some kind of arrangement. What kind of arrangement did you have in mind? You could sell the company back to my father. For what you paid, of course, plus interest. We could call it a misunderstanding. I sat down my wine glass and really looked at Jessica Reynolds, soon to be Walsh, 28 years old, beautiful, privileged, and absolutely convinced that her family's wealth made them untouchable. She'd probably never faced real consequences for anything in her entire life. Jessica, do you know what your father's company did to the Thompson family? She shook her head. Thompson Manufacturing had been in their family for 60 years. 3 generations of honest work employing half the people in their small town. When the economy hit them hard, they made the mistake of turning to Reynolds Holdings for help. Your father bought them out, stripped their assets, and sold their factory to developers. 60 years of family legacy became a shopping mall parking lot. Business is business, Jessica said, but her voice lacked conviction. Business is people, actually. The Thompsons lost everything. Their house, their savings, their reputation in the community. Mrs. Thompson had a heart attack 3 months after the sale. She's 67 years old and stocking shelves at a grocery store because your father stole her husband's pension fund. David had gone very quiet, staring at his hands. Jessica was still crying. But now it looked more like grief than panic. What do you want from us? David asked finally. It was the right question and I'd been waiting 3 days to answer it. I want you to understand that actions have consequences. I want you to learn that treating people with cruelty, even people you think don't matter, can come back to haunt you in ways you never imagined. And then we figure out how to move forward as a family if that's possible. Jessica wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, leaving mascara smudges that made her look younger and more vulnerable. What happens to my father? Your father is discovering what it feels like to be powerless. It's an educational experience I highly recommend. Mom, David said carefully. What are you planning to do with the company? Finally, the question that mattered. I smiled, thinking about the conversations I'd been having with Sarah Chin about restructuring plans and victim compensation funds. I'm going to fix it. Every company your father-in-law destroyed, every family he ruined, every pension fund he raided, I'm going to make it right. Reynolds Holdings is going to become exactly what it should have been all along. A company that builds things up instead of tearing them down. That's going to cost millions, David said. 47 million to be precise. It's amazing what you can accomplish when you're not motivated by greed. I stood up and walked to the kitchen, returning with a fresh bottle of wine, one from my own modest collection, purchased with my former customer service salary. Now then, I said, refilling their glasses. Let's talk about your wedding plans. I assume you'll need to make some adjustments to the budget. Jessica and David exchanged a look that spoke volumes. Their dream wedding at the Reynolds estate, with its unlimited budget and society guest list, had just evaporated along with Robert's empire. We can have a smaller ceremony, Jessica said quietly. Something simple. Nonsense, I replied. You're marrying my son. It should be exactly the celebration you want. They both stared at me as if I'd started speaking in ancient Greek. I don't understand, David said. I'm offering to pay for your wedding, sweetheart. Whatever kind of celebration would make you happy. The silence stretched between us, heavy with implications. David and Jessica could have their dream wedding, but it would be funded by the woman they'd mocked, hosted by the person who'd destroyed Jessica's father's legacy. Why would you do that? Jessica whispered. I looked at my son. Really looked at him for the first time since he'd announced his engagement. Despite everything that had happened, despite the cruelty and the humiliation, he was still the little boy who'd run to me with skinned knees and bad dreams. Because I love David and I want him to be happy even when he makes mistakes. David's eyes filled with tears. Mom, I'm so sorry about Thursday night, about everything we said. I know you are a sweetheart. Can you forgive us? I considered the question while I watched Jessica processing the fact that her future mother-in-law had just offered to fund the wedding her own father could no longer afford. Forgiveness isn't automatic, David, but it's possible. What do we need to do? And there it was, the moment I'd been building towards since Thursday night. The opportunity to teach my son and his fiancée that respect isn't negotiable, that kindness matters, and that sometimes the people you dismiss as powerless are exactly the ones you should fear most. We're going to start with some honest conversations about how this family is going to work going forward. And Jessica, she looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. Tomorrow morning, you're going to call your father and tell him that you and David would like to have dinner with him somewhere public. I have a few things I'd like to discuss with him in person. The look of pure terror that crossed Jessica's face was almost worth $47 million. Almost. The restaurant Jessica chose for Tuesday night's dinner was Lou Bernardin, an upscale French place downtown where the lighting was dim enough to hide tears and the tables spaced far enough apart for private conversations about corporate destruction. I arrived 15 minutes early, partly for tactical advantage and partly because I wanted to watch Robert Reynolds walk in and see me waiting for him. He looked like he'd aged 5 years in 2 days. Gone was the confident swagger I'd witnessed at Thursday's dinner party. His usual perfectly pressed suit was wrinkled, his hair unkempt, and his eyes had the hollow look of a man who'd spent the weekend staring into the abyss of his own financial ruin. David and Jessica were right behind him, both looking like they were attending a funeral, which in a way they were the funeral of their old understanding of power dynamics and family hierarchies. Margaret, Robert said, his voice carefully neutral, thank you for agreeing to meet. Thank you for accepting my invitation, I replied, standing to greet them. Though I suppose invitation isn't quite accurate, more like a summons. We took our seats around a corner table, the kind of arrangement that suggested either intimate family bonding or hostage negotiations. Given the circumstances, both descriptions seemed appropriate. I ordered wine, I announced as the server approached. A nice Bordeaux from 1995. Robert, you'll appreciate this. It's from the same vineyard where you celebrated closing the Henderson Textiles deal 3 years ago. Robert's face went pale. Henderson Textiles had been a family business for 4 generations before Reynolds Holdings acquired and dismantled it, leaving 87 people unemployed in a town that couldn't afford to lose a single job. How do you know about Henderson? He asked. I know about all of them, Robert. Thompson Manufacturing, Hartwell Communications, Cedar Valley Foods, Morrison Furniture, Blackwood Electronics, 43 companies to be exact. Should I continue? David and Jessica sat in silence, watching their perfect world crumble, one revelation at a time. I'd spent Monday researching every company Reynolds Holdings had acquired, and the pattern was always the same. Buy low, strip assets, eliminate jobs, sell high. You've been busy, Robert said. Very. Did you know that Henderson Textiles employed 3 generations of the same families? The Hendersons themselves, of course, but also the Millers, the Johnsons, the Washingtons. 87 people whose grandfathers had worked alongside each other, whose children grew up together, whose entire community was built around that factory. Business isn't sentimental, Robert replied. But his voice lacked its usual conviction. No, but it should be humane. Tell me, Robert, when you closed Henderson Textiles, did you think about where those 87 people would find work? Did you consider that Cedar Valley only had 2 major employers and you just eliminated one of them? The wine arrived, giving Robert a moment to compose himself. I watched him taste it and nod approval, probably wondering if this was the last expensive wine he'd ever drink as a free man. What do you want, Margaret? Justice, I said simply, for the Henderson family, for my former colleagues at Hartwell, for every person you've destroyed in pursuit of profit. I can't undo business decisions that were made years ago. No, but you can help me make them right. Jessica finally spoke up, her voice barely above a whisper. What does that mean? I pulled out a folder I'd prepared, thick with financial documents and legal papers. It means your father is going to help me contact every family affected by his business practices. He's going to explain what happened to their companies, their pension funds, their jobs, and then he's going to help me figure out how to compensate them. Compensate them how? David asked. I'm establishing a $50 million victim compensation fund. Every person who lost their job due to Reynolds Holdings actions will receive a settlement based on their years of service, age, and financial hardship. Robert's fork clattered against his plate. $50 million. That's more than the company was worth. Actually, it's exactly what those companies were worth to the people who built them. The Hendersons didn't just lose a business, Robert. They lost their identity, their legacy, their reason for getting up in the morning. How do you put a price on that? You can't rebuild the past, Robert said. But I could see something shifting in his expression. Not quite remorse, but maybe the beginning of understanding. No, but I can acknowledge it. I can look Mrs. Henderson in the eye and tell her that what happened to her family was wrong. I can give her enough money to retire with dignity instead of stocking shelves to survive. The main course arrived, but nobody was eating. We were all too busy processing the magnitude of what I was proposing. Dad, Jessica said carefully. Maybe we should consider this. If Mrs. Walsh is offering to help the families affected by the business decisions, they weren't business decisions, I interrupted. They were choices. Robert chose profit over people again and again because he never had to face the consequences. Now he does. And if I refuse to cooperate, Robert asked. I smiled, the same polite expression I'd perfected during 22 years of customer service. Then tomorrow morning, the FBI receives a comprehensive file detailing the pension fund irregularities I discovered in your business records. The Department of Labor gets a copy too. And the IRS gets some interesting documentation about your offshore accounting practices. Offshore accounting? David looked confused. What offshore accounting? Your father-in-law has been very creative with his tax obligations, sweetheart. Swiss bank accounts, Cayman Island shell companies, the works. All perfectly legal, I'm sure, but the kind of thing that attracts attention when combined with questionable pension fund management. Robert was gripping his wine glass so tightly I thought it might shatter. You're blackmailing me. I'm offering you a choice. You can help me make things right for the people you've hurt, or you can face the legal consequences of your actions alone. Either way, justice is coming. David reached across the table and touched my hand. Mom, this is really what you want to spend your inheritance on, strangers. I looked at my son, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time in years. David was a good person who'd gotten caught up in the wrong values, influenced by the wrong people. But underneath the entitlement and casual cruelty, he was still the boy who'd cried when we had to put down our old dog, who'd spent his allowance buying flowers for my birthday when he was 12. David, do you remember what your father used to say about money? His eyes softened with memory that it was a tool, not a goal. Your father was a good man who understood that wealth without purpose is just hoarding. This money gives me the power to help people who need it. How could I waste that opportunity on things I don't need? But $50 million, Mom. That's your security, your future. Sweetheart, I still have enough left over to buy this restaurant. My future is secure, but Mrs. Henderson's future isn't, and neither is yours if you keep following your father-in-law's example. Robert had been listening to this exchange with growing understanding. You're trying to teach them a lesson. I'm trying to teach all of you a lesson about consequences, about responsibility, about the fact that every business decision affects real people with real lives. And if we learn this lesson, then we move forward as a family. David and Jessica have their wedding. You help me contact the affected families and everyone gets a chance to be better than they were before. Jessica was crying again, but these tears looked different. Less panic, more grief. Mrs. Walsh, I need to ask you something. Of course, dear, when you were sitting at our dinner table last Thursday, listening to us mock you, what were you thinking? I considered the question while I watched this young woman wrestle with shame and regret. I was thinking that you were all very lucky. I'm a patient person and I was planning exactly how I was going to destroy your father's empire. Even then, you already knew what you were going to do, Jessica. I've spent my entire adult life being underestimated by people who thought their money made them better than me. Your father's dinner party wasn't the first time I'd been humiliated. Just the last time I was going to tolerate it. Robert cleared his throat, drawing our attention back to him. Margaret, if I agree to help you with this compensation fund, what happens to my family, Jessica and David? Their wedding, their future? Their future is whatever they make of it. But it will be built on honesty instead of exploitation. Me? What happens to me? I looked at Robert Reynolds. Really looked at him. Stripped of his company and his arrogance. He was just a frightened old man who'd spent 40 years making the wrong choices. But everyone deserves a chance at redemption. That depends entirely on you, Robert. Are you ready to face the people you've hurt and try to make things right? He was quiet for a long time, staring into his wine glass as if it contained answers to questions he'd never thought to ask. When he finally looked up, his eyes held something I'd never seen before. Genuine remorse. Yes, he said quietly. I think I am. But as we left the restaurant that night, none of us knew that Robert's cooperation was about to become the least of our problems because Jessica's mother, Patricia, had been busy making phone calls of her own. Wednesday morning brought an urgent phone call from Sarah Chin that shattered any illusion that my corporate takeover would proceed smoothly. Margaret, we have a problem, a big one. I was in my kitchen making coffee and enjoying the morning routine that had become infinitely more satisfying since I'd learned I could buy the coffee plantation if I wanted to. What kind of problem? Patricia Reynolds has hired Blackstone and Associates to challenge the acquisition. They're claiming you used insider information and coercion to force the sale. Blackstone and Associates. Even I'd heard of them. They were the kind of legal firm that specialized in protecting old money from new realities. Their clients included politicians, Fortune 500 CEOs, and anyone else who could afford to pay their astronomical fees to make problems disappear. Do they have a case? I asked. They might. If they can prove that you acquired privileged information about Reynolds Holdings'
financial situation through your relationship with Jessica and David, they could argue that the sale should be voided. I sat down heavily at my kitchen table, feeling the weight of $47 million shift from asset to liability. How privileged are we talking about? Margaret, did Robert Reynolds discuss his company's finances during that dinner party? Any specific details about debt, acquisitions, business strategies? I closed my eyes, remembering Robert's boastful speech about buying companies for pennies on the dollar, his casual mention of 43 acquisitions, his pride in eliminating unnecessary expenses, all delivered in front of witnesses who could testify that I'd been present. Yes, I said quietly. He told me quite a lot, actually. Then we need to be very careful about how we proceed. If Blackstone can convince a judge that you used family connections to gain insider access, I could lose everything. Not everything. But you could be forced to sell Reynolds Holdings back to Robert for what you paid plus legal fees and damages, and there could be criminal charges for securities fraud. I felt a cold fear settle in my stomach, different from anything I'd experienced during the acquisition process. I'd been so focused on justice and consequences that I hadn't considered the possibility of my own actions being challenged. What do we do? First, you need to avoid any contact with the Reynolds family until this is resolved. No phone calls, no meetings, no discussions about the case. Anything you say can and will be used against you. But Robert agreed to help with the compensation fund and David and Jessica's wedding. Margaret, listen to me very carefully. Patricia Reynolds has declared war. She's not trying to get her husband's company back. She's trying to destroy you completely. Personal vendetta, criminal charges, financial ruin, the whole package. I thought about Patricia's cold assessment of my worth during Thursday's dinner party. Her casual dismissal of my humanity based on my employment status. Of course she'd fight back. Women like Patricia Reynolds didn't accept defeat gracefully. How long do we have? The preliminary hearing is Monday. 5 days to prepare our defense and prove that the acquisition was legitimate. After I hung up, I sat in my quiet kitchen and tried to process the magnitude of what was happening. In attempting to teach the Reynolds family about consequences, I'd walked straight into their world. A world where money and connections could rewrite reality, where justice was negotiable if you knew the right lawyers. My phone rang. David's number. Mom, I just heard about the lawsuit. Are you okay? The sound of my son's voice, concerned and loving, almost broke my resolve to avoid contact with the family. I'm fine, sweetheart, but my lawyer says we shouldn't talk until this is resolved. Oh, that's insane. You're my mother. We can't just stop talking because of some legal technicality. David, this is serious. If your mother-in-law can prove I used information I gained through family connections, then we make sure she can't prove it. The certainty in his voice surprised me. What do you mean? I mean, Jessica and I were at that dinner party too. We heard everything Dad said and were prepared to testify that he volunteered that information freely without any prompting from you. I felt tears prick my eyes. Despite everything, the humiliation, the financial warfare, the family drama, my son was choosing to stand with me. David, that could put you in a difficult position with Jessica's family. Mom, I've spent the last 2 days thinking about what you said at dinner about consequences and treating people with respect. I may have married into the Reynolds family, but I'm still a Walsh. And Walshes don't let each other fight alone. What does Jessica think? There was a pause. Jessica's struggling. Her mother is furious about the whole situation and she's pressuring Jess to support the lawsuit. But Jess knows what happened at that dinner party. She knows her father brought this on himself. And her loyalty is being tested in ways she never expected. But Mom, I think she's stronger than anyone gives her credit for, including herself. That afternoon, against Sarah Chen's advice, I drove to the address Jessica had texted me. It was a small coffee shop in a part of town the Reynolds family probably didn't know existed. The kind of place where conversations could happen without society photographers or family spies. Jessica was waiting in a corner booth, looking younger and more uncertain than I'd ever seen her. She traded her designer clothes for jeans and a simple sweater, and without her usual careful makeup, I could see the exhaustion in her face. "Thank you for coming," she said. "I wasn't sure you would. My lawyer would have a heart attack if she knew I was here." "Mine too." Jessica managed a weak smile, though I'm not sure whose side my lawyer is on anymore. I ordered coffee and settled across from her, noting the way she twisted her engagement ring, David's grandmother's ring, the one piece of jewelry I'd insisted he give her instead of some expensive new symbol. "How are you holding up?" "I'm not. Honestly, my mother hasn't spoken to me since I told her I wouldn't support the lawsuit. My father is devastated about losing the company. David's caught in the middle of everything, and I'm realizing that everything I thought I knew about my family was wrong. That's a lot to process. Mrs. Walsh, can I ask you something? That night at dinner, when my father was talking about his business, were you already planning to buy the company?" The question I'd been dreading, asked by the one person whose answer could determine my fate. I looked into Jessica's eyes and made a choice that would either save or damn us all. "Yes," I said. "From the moment your father bragged about destroying family businesses, I knew exactly what I was going to do to him." Jessica nodded slowly. "So, you did use information from our family dinner to plan your attack?" "I used your father's own words to understand his vulnerabilities." "Yes. And legally that could be considered insider information." "According to your mother's lawyers, yes." We sat in silence, sipping coffee that tasted like ashes while the weight of the truth settled between us. "Mrs. Walsh, there's something else you need to know about my mother's plans." "What kind of plans?" Jessica looked around nervously as if Patricia Reynolds might materialize from behind the espresso machine. "She's not just trying to get the company back. She's trying to have you arrested for securities fraud, elder abuse, and conspiracy." "Elder abuse?" "She's claiming you manipulated my father's emotional state to coerce him into selling below market value. That you took advantage of his distress to force an unconscionable contract." The irony was breathtaking. Patricia Reynolds, whose husband had spent 40 years financially abusing vulnerable families, was now claiming to be the victim of manipulation. "Jessica, you were there when your father agreed to sell. Was he coerced?" "No, he was defeated but not coerced. You gave him a choice between cooperation and legal consequences. That's negotiation, not manipulation. Are you willing to testify to that?" Jessica was quiet for a long time, staring into her coffee cup. "Mrs. Walsh, if I testify for you, my mother will disown me completely. No family support, no trust fund, no safety net if things go wrong with David. And if you testify for her, then I help destroy the woman my husband loves. And I prove that I'm exactly the kind of person who values money over integrity." I reached across the table and took her hand. "Jessica, I'm not going to pressure you to choose sides. This situation is complicated enough without adding family manipulation to it. But you need my testimony to win. I need the truth to win, whether you're the one who tells it or not." Jessica squeezed my hand and I saw something in her face that I'd never seen before. Real courage, the kind that comes from choosing principles over comfort. "Mrs. Walsh, there's something my mother doesn't know. Something that could change everything." "What?" "I recorded my father's confession at dinner last night. The whole conversation where he admitted to the pension fund problems and agreed to help with your compensation fund." My heart stopped. "You what?" I've been recording family conversations for months. My therapist suggested it to help me process my relationship with my parents. I have hours of recordings where they discuss their business practices, their treatment of employees, their tax evasion strategies. Jessica, do you understand what this means? It means I can prove that everything you did was in response to crimes my father was already committing. That you didn't manipulate him, you caught him. I stared at this young woman who had just offered to destroy her own family to protect mine. Why would you do this? Because David loves you and because you're trying to help people my father hurt. And because, she paused, tears flowing freely now, because I want to be the kind of person who does the right thing even when it's terrifying. But as we left the coffee shop that afternoon, neither of us knew that Patricia Reynolds had hired more than just lawyers. She'd hired a private investigator who'd been following Jessica all week, and he had just photographed our entire conversation. Thursday morning brought a new crisis that made Patricia's lawsuit seem almost quaint. I was reviewing legal documents with Sarah Chin when her assistant burst into the conference room with a look of pure panic. "Miss Chin, you need to see the news right now." Sarah clicked on her computer and within seconds we were watching a local news report that made my blood run cold. Exclusive investigation into alleged securities fraud involving the recent hostile takeover of Reynolds Holdings. Channel 7 has obtained evidence suggesting that Margaret Walsh, the mystery buyer who acquired the $40 million company earlier this week, may have used family connections to gain illegal insider information. The reporter was standing outside the Reynolds Holdings building, my building now, with a graphic behind her showing my driver's license photo next to the word fraud in bold red letters. Sources close to the Reynolds family report that Walsh, who is the mother-in-law of Robert Reynolds' daughter, attended a family dinner where confidential business information was allegedly discussed. This information may have been used to orchestrate what financial experts are calling one of the most aggressive corporate raids in recent memory. Sarah muted the volume and turned to me with an expression I'd never seen on her face before: genuine fear. "Margaret, this changes everything. Once something hits the news cycle, it becomes about public perception, not just legal facts. Judges don't like to appear sympathetic to people who've been painted as criminals. How did they get this information so quickly? Patricia Reynolds has connections everywhere. Media, legal, political. She's not just fighting for her husband's company anymore. She's fighting for her family's reputation." My phone was buzzing nonstop with calls from reporters, blocked numbers, and people I hadn't heard from in years who suddenly wanted to know if I was really the mystery millionaire they'd seen on the news. I turned it off and tried to focus on what Sarah was telling me about emergency legal strategies. But the truth was I was scared, really, deeply terrified in a way I hadn't been since the morning I discovered $47 million in my bank account. The woman who'd bought Reynolds Holdings had been confident, strategic, powerful. The woman on the news looked like a criminal. What do we do now? We accelerate everything. The preliminary hearing is Monday, but if this media attention continues to build, we might not make it that far. Patricia could get an emergency injunction to freeze the acquisition pending investigation. Which means you could lose control of Reynolds Holdings before we can prove the acquisition was legitimate. All those families you wanted to help, all the compensation you planned to provide, it all disappears if the sale gets voided. I thought about Mrs. Henderson's stocking shelves at 73 because Robert Reynolds had stolen her husband's pension. About the families in Cedar Valley who'd lost their jobs when their factory closed. About the hundreds of people counting on justice that might never come if I lost this fight. Sarah, I need you to do something for me, something that might be ethically questionable. Margaret, we're already walking a very thin line legally. I don't think so. Call Jessica Reynolds and tell her I want to expedite the compensation fund today, before Patricia can stop us. You want to distribute $50 million in one day? I want to distribute as much as possible before they freeze my assets. If families are going to be helped, it needs to happen now. Sarah stared at me as if I'd suggested we rob a bank. Margaret, that looks exactly like someone trying to hide assets before a fraud investigation. It could be interpreted as evidence of guilt. Or it could be interpreted as someone trying to do the right thing before legal technicalities make it impossible. It's insane. It's justice. That afternoon, while Sarah worked frantically to set up emergency financial transfers, I drove to David's apartment for what might be our last conversation before Patricia's legal machine crushed everything I'd tried to build. David and Jessica were waiting for me with coffee and the kind of forced optimism people use when discussing a terminal diagnosis. They'd obviously seen the news coverage. Jessica's eyes were red from crying, and David looked like he'd aged 5 years since our dinner Monday night. "Mom, we need to talk about Jessica's recordings." I sat down across from them, noting how they'd positioned themselves as a united front. Despite everything that had happened, their marriage was surviving the chaos I'd created in their lives. "What about them?" Jessica leaned forward, her voice steady despite her obvious exhaustion. "I've been reviewing all the recordings I made over the past 6 months. Family dinners, business meetings, phone calls with my father's associates. Mrs. Walsh, what I have here is evidence of systematic financial crimes going back years." "What kind of crimes?" "Pension fund theft, tax evasion, bribery of local officials, fraudulent bankruptcy filings for acquired companies. My father hasn't just been destroying businesses, he's been stealing from them." David pulled out a laptop and opened an audio file. "Mom, you need to hear this. It's from a dinner party at the Reynolds house 3 months ago." Robert Reynolds's voice filled the room, slurred with wine and loosened by success. "The beauty of the Morrison furniture deal is that they'll never figure out where their pension money went. By the time the lawyers sort through the subsidiary holdings and shell companies, we'll have moved the funds offshore." "Morrison Furniture?" I asked. "A family business in Pennsylvania," Jessica said quietly. 300 employees, most of them near retirement. My father stole their entire pension fund, $17 million, and funneled it through Caribbean shell companies. I listened to recording after recording, each one documenting a new crime, a new victim, a new family destroyed by Robert Reynolds's greed. By the time Jessica finished playing them, I understood that my acquisition of Reynolds Holdings hadn't just been justice. It had been essential. "Jessica, do you realize what you're giving me? I'm giving you the truth, and I'm giving you the evidence to prove that everything you did was justified. But you're also destroying your father and your family." She was quiet for a moment, looking at David, then back at me. "Mrs. Walsh, I've been thinking about what you said at dinner about how business decisions affect real people. I grew up thinking my father was a successful businessman. Now I know he's a criminal who's destroyed hundreds of lives." "And your mother?" "My mother knows. She's always known. She just didn't care because the money was too good." David reached over and took Jessica's hand. "Mom, we've made a decision. We want to help you get this evidence to the proper authorities, not just to save the Reynolds Holdings acquisition, but to make sure all of Dad's crimes are exposed. David, this will destroy Jessica's family completely." "It will hold them accountable," Jessica corrected. "There's a difference." But as we sat in David's living room planning how to use Jessica's recordings to expose 40 years of corporate crime, none of us knew that Patricia Reynolds was putting her own plan into motion. A plan that involved more than just lawyers and private investigators. Because at exactly 6 p.m. that Thursday evening, while we were reviewing evidence of her husband's crimes, Patricia Reynolds was placing a phone call to someone who specialized in problems that couldn't be solved in courtrooms. Someone whose solutions were permanent. "I need this woman gone," she said to the voice on the other end. "I don't care how you do it, but I need Margaret Walsh eliminated before she can destroy my family." The voice assured her that the problem would be handled quietly, professionally, and permanently. Friday morning started with Sarah Chen calling me at 6 a.m. with urgency that sent ice through my veins. "Margaret, don't leave your apartment. Don't answer the door. Don't talk to anyone until I get there." "What's wrong?" "Someone broke into my office last night. They didn't take anything, but they went through all the files related to your case. Every document, every piece of evidence, everything Jessica provided about her father's crimes." I sat up in bed, fully awake now. "Did they copy anything?" "That's what I'm afraid of. Margaret, whoever did this wasn't looking for money or equipment. They wanted information about our legal strategy and what evidence we have against Robert Reynolds. Patricia or someone she hired. But Margaret, there's something else. Something that makes me think this isn't just about the lawsuit anymore." "What?" "They left a message written on my desk blotter in red ink. Some problems require permanent solutions." The words hit me like a physical blow. I'd been so focused on legal warfare that I'd forgotten that people with Patricia Reynolds's resources didn't limit themselves to courtroom battles. "Sarah, are you saying?" "I'm saying Patricia Reynolds has escalated this beyond anything we prepared for, And I'm saying you need protection until we can figure out how far she's willing to go. I spent Friday in a kind of suspended animation, trapped in my apartment while Sarah worked with law enforcement to investigate the break-in and assess the threat level. David and Jessica took turns calling to check on me, their voices tight with worry that went beyond concern about lawsuits and financial consequences. By afternoon, Sarah had news that confirmed our worst fears. Margaret, the police found something interesting when they processed the crime scene. The person who broke into my office left fingerprints on one of the filing cabinets, prints that match someone with an extensive criminal record. What kind of criminal record? The kind that includes assault, intimidation, and at least one suspicious death that was ruled accidental but never fully investigated. I felt the room tilt around me. Patricia hired a professional. Someone did. The question is whether they hired him to scare us or to eliminate the threat you represent to the Reynolds family. That evening, against everyone's advice, I met Jessica at the same coffee shop where we'd talked earlier in the week. But this time I wasn't alone. Sarah had insisted on a police escort that waited outside while we talked. Jessica looked terrified, which confirmed my suspicion that she knew more about her mother's escalation than she'd admitted. "Mrs. Walsh, I need to tell you something about my mother. Something that might explain why she's reacting so extremely to your acquisition of the company." "What?" "She's not just fighting for my father's business. She's fighting for her life." I stared at Jessica, trying to understand what she meant. "Explain." "My mother isn't just my father's wife. She's been his business partner from the beginning. Every company they acquired, every pension fund they stole, every family they destroyed, she was involved in planning and executing it all. So she's as culpable as Robert. More. My father is greedy and cruel, but my mother is strategic. She's the one who figured out how to move money offshore, how to create shell companies, how to make evidence disappear. The criminal empire they built belongs to both of them." I thought about Patricia's cold assessment of my worth during that first dinner party, her casual dismissal of people she considered beneath her station. Now I understood that her cruelty wasn't just social snobbery. It was the calculated indifference of someone who'd spent decades destroying lives for profit. "Jessica, if your mother is involved in the criminal activity, then she faces the same charges as my father when the evidence comes out: tax evasion, fraud, conspiracy, theft. She could spend the rest of her life in prison. So this isn't just about getting the company back. It's about eliminating the threat before the evidence can be presented. Mrs. Walsh, my mother isn't going to stop with legal challenges. She's going to keep escalating until either she wins or I'm no longer a problem." We sat in silence, sipping coffee that tasted like fear and regret. Outside, I could see the unmarked police car with the officers Sarah had insisted on. Their presence was both reassuring and terrifying. "Jessica, I need to ask you something. Are you safe? If your mother suspects you're helping me." "She doesn't suspect. She knows." Jessica's voice was barely a whisper. "She confronted me this morning. She knows about the recordings, about our meetings, about everything." "What did she say?" "She said I had a choice: family loyalty or personal destruction. She gave me 24 hours to decide whether I was going to support her lawsuit or be written out of the family completely." "And what did you tell her?" Jessica met my eyes with a courage I was only beginning to understand. "I told her I'd already made my choice when I decided to marry David. That my loyalty belongs to the family I'm building, not the family I'm leaving behind." "How did she react?" "She said I was making the biggest mistake of my life. That I was choosing the wrong side of a war I couldn't win. And then she said something that made my blood run cold." "What?" "She said that sometimes people who make the wrong choices don't live long enough to regret them." I felt fear settle in my stomach like a stone. Patricia Reynolds wasn't just threatening my financial security anymore. She was threatening my life and Jessica's life, and potentially David's life if he continued to support us. "Jessica, you and David need to leave town tonight. Go somewhere safe until this is resolved. We're not running away. This isn't about courage. This is about survival." But Jessica shook her head with the kind of determination that reminded me why David had fallen in love with her. "Mrs. Walsh, if we run now, my mother wins. He gets the company back. She destroys the evidence of her crimes. And all those families you want to help never get justice. If you stay and something happens to you, David will never forgive me. And if we leave and something happens to you, I'll never forgive myself. We left the coffee shop that night with a plan that was probably insane but felt like our only option. Jessica would return home and act as if she was considering her mother's ultimatum, buying us time to get the evidence to the FBI before Patricia could eliminate the witnesses. David would publicly distance himself from me, making it appear that family pressure was working, and I would proceed with the compensation fund distribution, making sure that at least some of the victims got help before Patricia's escalation reached its inevitable conclusion. But as I walked to my police escort, I noticed something that made my blood freeze. A black sedan with tinted windows parked across the street with a clear view of the coffee shop entrance, the same car that had been parked outside my apartment building that morning. Someone was watching us. Someone was tracking our movements, our meetings, our plans. And as we drove away, the sedan pulled into traffic behind us, maintaining a careful distance that suggested professional surveillance. Patricia Reynolds had moved beyond legal warfare. The question now was whether we would survive whatever came next. Saturday morning exploded into chaos at exactly 7:23 a.m. when Sarah Chin called with news that changed everything we thought we knew about the Reynolds family and their willingness to protect their secrets. "Margaret, you need to get to the hospital now." "What happened?" "Someone tried to kill Jessica last night." The words hit me like a physical blow. I was already reaching for my clothes, my hands shaking as I tried to process what Sarah was telling me. "Is she alive?" "She's alive, but barely. Margaret, this wasn't a random attack. Someone broke into her apartment and tried to make it look like a burglary gone wrong. If David hadn't come home early from his business trip." I didn't let her finish. I was already running to my car, the police escort scrambling to keep up as I drove through morning traffic with the kind of desperate speed that comes from knowing someone you care about is fighting for their life. The hospital corridor outside the ICU was a war zone of grief and rage. David was pacing like a caged animal, his clothes still bloody from finding Jessica unconscious on their apartment floor. Sarah Chin was there with 2 FBI agents, their presence confirming that this had escalated beyond anything local law enforcement could handle. "Mom." David's voice broke when he saw me. I pulled him into my arms, feeling him shake with the kind of terror that comes from almost losing the person you love most. "How is she?" "Concussion, broken ribs, internal bleeding. The doctors say if I'd been 15 minutes later." He couldn't finish the sentence. "Who did this?" That's when FBI agent Rodriguez stepped forward with a grim expression that told me we were dealing with something much larger than Patricia's lawsuit. "Mrs. Walsh, we need to talk about the Reynolds family, about the evidence you've been gathering, and about why someone is willing to commit murder to stop you." We moved to a private conference room where Agent Rodriguez laid out a case file that made my acquisition of Reynolds Holdings look like a minor business dispute. "Mrs. Walsh, the FBI has been investigating Reynolds Holdings for 18 months as part of a larger probe into organized financial crime. What you've uncovered through your acquisition and Mrs. Jessica Reynolds's recordings has accelerated our investigation by years." Organized financial crime? Robert and Patricia Reynolds aren't just corporate raiders. They're money launderers for a network that includes drug cartels, human trafficking operations, and political corruption schemes. The pension funds they've been stealing, that money doesn't just disappear. It gets cleaned through their shell companies and funneled into criminal enterprises. I felt the room spin around me. "Are you saying my son married into a crime family?" "I'm saying your son's in-laws are connected to some extremely dangerous people who don't tolerate threats to their financial operations. When you acquired Reynolds Holdings and started talking about compensation funds and federal investigations, you didn't just threaten their business. You threatened their freedom and their lives." Agent Rodriguez opened another file, this one containing photographs that made my stomach turn. Crime scenes, bodies, suspicious accidents involving people who'd crossed the Reynolds network. "Mrs. Walsh, in the past 5 years, 7 people who posed threats to Reynolds Holdings operations have died in accidents, car crashes, house fires, apparent heart attacks that were never fully investigated. And you think they tried to make Jessica?" "We know they did. The man who attacked Mrs. Reynolds is someone we've been tracking for months. A professional assassin with connections to the same network that's been laundering money through your son's in-law's business." "But Jessica is Patricia's daughter. How could she order an attack on her own child?" Agent Rodriguez exchanged glances with his partner. "Mrs. Walsh, that's where this case gets even darker. We don't think Patricia ordered the attack on Jessica." "Then who?" "We think Jessica was supposed to be a message to you. Proof that no one in your family is safe until you return Reynolds Holdings and forget everything you've learned about their operations. I thought about Patricia's ultimatum to Jessica, her demand for family loyalty or complete exclusion. But this was beyond family pressure. This was organized crime with roots that went deeper than I'd ever imagined. What happens now? Now we use the evidence you and Jessica gathered to bring down not just the Reynolds family but their entire criminal network. The recordings, the financial documents, the shell company connections. It's enough to destroy a money laundering operation that's been running for decades. And the danger to my family continues until we can arrest everyone involved. Mrs. Walsh, these people have killed to protect their secrets. They won't stop trying until they're stopped permanently. That afternoon, while Jessica underwent surgery to repair internal damage from her attack, I sat with David in the hospital waiting room and made the hardest decision of my life. David, I want you to know that if anything happens to me, the compensation fund money is already protected. Sarah has distributed as much as we could legally move, and the rest is in an irrevocable trust for the victims' families. Mom, don't talk like that. Someone tried to murder your wife last night. This isn't a time for optimism. Which is exactly why you need to end this. Give them back the company. Forget about the compensation fund, and let's all disappear somewhere safe until this blows over. I looked at my son, my brave, loving, terrified son, and saw David's father in his eyes, the same moral core that had driven my husband to become a teacher instead of chasing money, the same integrity that made him believe right and wrong mattered more than personal safety. David, do you remember what your father used to say about bullies? That you never defeat them by running away? Your father was right. The Reynolds family has been destroying lives for 40 years because no one was powerful enough to stop them. Now someone is. If I back down now, Jessica's attack means nothing. All those families stay destroyed. All that money stays stolen. All those criminals stay free. And if you don't back down, they kill you. Maybe, but they might kill me anyway just to send a message to the next person who tries to hold them accountable. David was quiet for a long time, staring at his hands while machines beeped in the distance and families dealt with their own crises in other waiting rooms. Mom, there's something I need to tell you. Something Jessica and I discovered before the attack. What? We found evidence that Patricia and Robert aren't just laundering money for criminals. They're planning to disappear. New identities, offshore accounts, the whole package. They're going to abandon Jessica, flee the country, and let someone else take the blame for their crimes. I stared at my son as the implications hit me. They were going to sacrifice their own daughter. Jessica isn't their daughter. Mom, she's adopted. Patricia told her years ago that if she ever became a liability instead of an asset, she'd be cut loose completely, which explains why they were willing to have her attacked and why she's been so desperate to prove her loyalty to our family instead of theirs. That's when I understood the full scope of what we were fighting. The Reynolds family wasn't just criminal, they were sociopathic. They'd raised Jessica as a commodity, valued her only as long as she was useful, and discarded her the moment she chose justice over complicity. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd underestimated what a mother would do to protect her family. David, I need you to stay here with Jessica. Don't leave the hospital. Don't talk to anyone from the Reynolds family. And don't trust anyone except the FBI agents. Where are you going? I stood up, feeling $47 million transform from wealth into weapons, from assets into ammunition for the war Patricia Reynolds had started. I'm going to end this tonight before they can hurt anyone else we love. But as I walked out of the hospital that evening, I didn't know that Patricia Reynolds was already putting her final plan into motion. A plan that would either destroy everything I'd built or prove that justice sometimes requires the kind of courage that looks exactly like insanity. The warehouse where I was supposed to meet Patricia Reynolds looked exactly like the kind of place where people disappear permanently. Abandoned, isolated, surrounded by the kind of darkness that swallows screams and hides secrets. But I'd come anyway because some conversations can only happen between predators who finally recognize each other. Sarah Chin had begged me not to come alone. The FBI had insisted they could provide protection. David had actually tried to physically stop me from leaving the hospital, but they all misunderstood what was happening here. This wasn't about protection anymore. This was about ending a war that Patricia Reynolds had started when she decided my family was expendable. I parked my car exactly where Patricia's text had instructed and walked toward the warehouse entrance, my purse heavy with more than just the usual contents. The FBI wire Sarah had insisted on was carefully hidden, though I suspected Patricia would be smart enough to check for surveillance. The real insurance policy was in the sealed envelope I'd left with Sarah. Evidence that would destroy the entire Reynolds criminal network if anything happened to me tonight. Patricia was waiting in the center of the warehouse floor, illuminated by a single overhead light that created dramatic shadows worthy of a film noir movie. She looked exactly like what she was. A woman who'd spent 40 years perfecting the art of destroying lives and was now facing the possibility of losing everything she'd built. "Margaret, thank you for coming. Thank you for not sending another assassin." Patricia smiled, the same cold expression she'd worn during our first dinner party. "That was business. Nothing personal. Though I admit I underestimated your emotional investment in my worthless adopted daughter. Jessica is worth more than your entire criminal empire. Jessica is a liability who forgot where her loyalties belong. But she'll recover and hopefully learn from this experience." I looked around the warehouse, noting the multiple exits, the shadows that could hide additional threats, the careful positioning that gave Patricia every advantage. "What do you want, Patricia?" "I want my life back. My company, my money, my freedom to live without looking over my shoulder for federal agents." "And in exchange?" "In exchange, your family lives. David keeps his law career. Jessica recovers from her unfortunate accident, and you enjoy a comfortable retirement funded by what's left of your inheritance after you've returned what you stole from us." The audacity was breathtaking. Patricia Reynolds, whose criminal network had destroyed hundreds of families, was negotiating as if she was the victim of my unreasonable demands. "What makes you think I'd trust any deal you offer?" "Because the alternative is that everyone you care about suffers the same fate as Jessica, but permanently this time." That's when I understood that Patricia Reynolds had never planned for this conversation to end with both of us walking away alive. This wasn't a negotiation. It was a confession before an execution. "Patricia, can I ask you something? When you decided to have your own daughter attacked, did you feel anything at all?" "Jessica isn't my daughter. She's a project that failed to meet expectations." "And David, my son, what's your plan for him?" "David will grieve appropriately for his mother's tragic accident, inherit what's left of your money, and hopefully choose more suitable business associations in the future." I pulled out my phone and pressed record, though I suspected Patricia was beyond caring about evidence at this point. "Tell me about the money laundering operation. I'm curious how you built such an extensive criminal network." Patricia laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "You think you're clever trying to get me to confess? Margaret, darling, you're never leaving this warehouse alive. I can tell you anything I want. So tell me." And she did. For the next 20 minutes, Patricia Reynolds laid out 40 years of criminal activity with the pride of an artist describing her masterpiece. The pension funds weren't just stolen, they were converted into untraceable assets for drug cartels and human trafficking operations. The shell companies weren't just tax evasion. They were elaborate money laundering schemes that cleaned billions of dollars for international crime syndicates. "The beauty of it," Patricia explained, "is that legitimate businesses provide perfect cover for illegitimate activities. Who suspects that a pension fund theft is actually cartel money being integrated into the legitimate banking system? And the murders, the accidents, that eliminated threats to your operation? Sometimes people ask too many questions. Sometimes federal investigators get too close to the truth. Sometimes mothers-in-law acquire too much evidence and develop dangerous ideas about justice." Patricia reached into her purse and withdrew a gun, the kind of small, efficient weapon that suggested she'd used it before. "Any other questions before we conclude our business?" But that's when Patricia Reynolds made her final fatal mistake. She assumed I'd come to this warehouse as a victim instead of as someone who'd spent the last week learning exactly how dangerous desperate people could become. "Actually, Patricia, I do have one more question. How do you think the FBI is going to react when they review the recording of this conversation?" Patricia's confident expression flickered. "What recording?" I pulled out my phone, showing her the screen that indicated our entire conversation had been live-streamed to Sarah Chen's computer, where FBI agents had been listening to every word. "The recording where you confessed to money laundering, murder, conspiracy, and attempted murder of your own daughter. Though I think they'll be particularly interested in the part where you threatened to kill my son." Patricia's face went white as she realized what had happened, but the gun in her hand didn't waver. "It doesn't matter. You'll still be dead and recordings can be explained as deepfakes or fabrications. True, but the FBI agents surrounding this warehouse right now won't be fabrications. That's when the floodlights hit, turning the dark warehouse into daylight, and Patricia Reynolds discovered that the hunter had become the hunted. FBI. Drop your weapon. The next few minutes were chaos. Shouting, movement, Patricia's desperate attempt to use me as a human shield before being taken down by agents who'd been waiting for exactly this moment. But all I could think about was David and Jessica, safe in the hospital, finally free from the shadow of Patricia's criminal empire. 2 weeks later, I was sitting in the hospital room where Jessica was recovering from her injuries, watching her and David plan their wedding with the kind of excitement that comes from knowing they'd survived something that should have destroyed them. "Mrs. Walsh," Jessica said, looking up from the wedding magazines scattered across her bed, "I need to apologize for everything my family put you through." "Jessica, you're not responsible for their choices. But I am responsible for mine. And I chose right even when it was terrifying." David reached over and squeezed his wife's hand. "Mom, what are you going to do now? With the company, the money, all of it." I looked out the window at the city where I'd lived my entire life, thinking about the families who would receive compensation, the criminals who would face justice, the legacy I was building from the ashes of Patricia's empire. I'm going to do exactly what I planned from the beginning: help people who need it, hold criminals accountable, and prove that sometimes justice comes from the most unexpected places. And Reynolds Holdings will be restructured as a victim advocacy organization. Every company your former in-laws destroyed will be compensated. Every pension fund they stole will be repaid with interest. Every family they hurt will receive justice. Jessica started crying again, but these were different tears: relief, gratitude, hope. "Mrs. Walsh, why did you risk everything for people you'd never met?" I thought about the question while I watched my son and daughter-in-law begin to rebuild their lives on a foundation of honesty instead of exploitation. Because someone had to, and because I finally had the power to do something that mattered. 6 months later, I was standing in the community center in Cedar Valley, surrounded by 300 people whose lives had been destroyed by Reynolds Holdings and were now being restored by the compensation fund. Mrs. Henderson was there, no longer stocking shelves but planning her retirement with dignity. The Thompson family had enough money to start a new business. The families from Morrison Furniture could finally stop worrying about their golden years. But the best part was David and Jessica standing beside me as we presented the final round of compensation checks. They'd chosen to work for the victim advocacy organization, using their legal and business skills to help other families who'd been destroyed by corporate greed. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said to the crowd, looking out at faces that showed the kind of hope that money can't buy but justice can provide. 6 months ago you were told that the crimes committed against your families were just business decisions. Today you know they were crimes, and you've seen that justice is possible when people refuse to accept that powerful people are untouchable. The applause was deafening. But all I could hear was Patricia Reynolds' voice from the warehouse asking what made me think I could win against people like her. The answer was simple. I hadn't won because I was more powerful or more clever or more connected. I'd won because I was right. And sometimes, in a world that often feels rigged against ordinary people, being right is enough to change everything. As for Patricia and Robert Reynolds, they're both serving life sentences for racketeering, money laundering, conspiracy, and murder. Their criminal network has been dismantled, their offshore accounts seized, their victims compensated. But their greatest punishment might be knowing that their downfall came from the woman they dismissed as powerless, worthless, and invisible. Sometimes the best revenge is proving that you were never any of those things. You were just underestimated. And $47 million made sure that underestimation was the last mistake they'd ever make. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters. Subscribe please my channel for more videos.